Hello, and welcome to Wesley United Methodist Church of Trenton, Missouri. Our church is located at 113 East 9th Street, which is on the corner of 9th and Washington in Trenton, Missouri. You can call our office between the hours of 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, Monday through Friday at 660-359-6762, or visit our website at wesleyunitedmethodist.us. Now we invite you to open your heart, mind, and body to the Word of God with Reverend Barry Boulware.
We begin with some notable words from some of the finest minds found in a variety of professions. Loren Eiseley, the late anthropologist, grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. When he was a young man, his health broke. He had to drop out of school. It was during the Great Depression, and he did what a lot of young men did in those days. He began to ride the rails. He met a certain transient one day just near the city limits of a large Midwestern city. And this man said to Loren Eiseley, "I am glad to be out of prison, just right out here breathing air." His brown eyes, hurt eyes, traveled over several faces and then came to rest on mine, Eiseley wrote. "Ain't nobody can fix things up having to do with people," the man said. "Ain't nobody can do that. People got no knack that way. People can make railroads. People can build all of them buildings over there," as he gestured towards the city sky. "But they can't figure themselves out." Next, we hear from Rudyard Kipling, the brilliant English poet, who one day was speaking to the graduating class at McGill University. He advised the graduates not to care too much for money or power or fame, because he said, "Someday you will meet a man who cares for none of these things, and you will then know how poor you really are." And then one day, a certain minister called for an appointment with Dr. Carl Jung, the renowned Swiss psychologist. The minister was obviously on the ragged edge of breaking down. He was working 14, 16 hours a day. And Jung began by asking if he wanted to get well. And the minister said indignantly that of course he did. Jung gave him a simple prescription. He was to work 8 hours a day, not 14, sleep 8 hours a day, and the remaining hours he was to spend all alone in his study in quiet. Several days later, the two men got back together. The minister was visibly worse off than before. Dr. Jung inquired about how he had followed instructions, and the minister said that each day he worked only 8 hours, slept another 8 hours. "But what did you do with the remaining hours?" Dr. Jung asked. And the man said, "Well, he played a few Chopin pieces, finished a Hermann Hesse novel, read Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, and listened to Mozart and his sonatas." "But you don't understand," Dr. Jung told him. "I didn't want you to be with Hermann Hesse or Thomas Mann or Mozart or Chopin. I wanted you to be all alone with yourself." At this, the minister looked terrified and gasped, "But I can't think of any worse company." To this, Dr. Jung said, "And yet, this is the self that you inflict upon other people 14 hours a day?" And finally, there is William James, that great educator, who once said that 85% of our suffering is probably self-induced. The real issues of life, he writes, more often than not, are decided within us. It's not the external pressures that undo us, he says. It's the trouble within. And then using Shakespeare as a resource, Dr. James said, Shakespeare knew this, and he built his tragedies around this insight. He saw that life's real tragedies lurks within ourselves. The old Greek dramatists, as they wrote their plays, caused their victims to suffer tragedy because of some mysterious cosmic fate or because of the whims of the gods. But Shakespeare shifted the battlefield to the souls of the people. People like you and me, he writes. Hamlet wrestles with his own hesitant indecisions. Macbeth wrestles with his own ambitions and remorse. Othello wrestles with his own insatiable journey. What do all four of these stories have in common that I've just shared with you? Well, in words, once again from Shakespeare, the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. And with that thought, let's move on to our biblical text for this morning. We would be hard-pressed to find someone in either the Old or the New Testament more committed to God than Moses. Now, of course, we can say Jesus, but Jesus he's in a category all unto himself. When you look at what Moses accomplished, when you examine his faithfulness to God, who deserves a higher billing than Moses throughout the Bible? I can't really think of anyone else. Again, of course, Jesus. And yet, today's story shines a light of truth on the biggest shortcoming that we find in Moses' entire life. Yes, I know that Moses once killed an Egyptian, but he did that so that that Egyptian would stop killing Hebrew people themselves. I don't find fault with Moses for that. In today's text, Moses committed an unmitigated mistake. The people were out in the wilderness, and they had been without water for some time. They grew afraid. That's natural. But this wasn't the first time that God had provided water for the people in an amazing way. And so the people expressed their fears to Moses. Moses left the people, sought solitude, went to the tent of meeting, which was the traveling tabernacle. And here is what God said to Moses. Take the staff, you and your brother Aaron gather the people together, speak to the rock in front of them, and it will pour out its water. Moses went back to that rock in question. He and Aaron stood there before the people. Then Moses said to the people, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water from this rock?" We can sense Moses' frustration here. The people demand food one day, water the next day. Moses was frustrated. He probably wondered, what's next? They're going to ask me for sunscreen out here in the wilderness. So Moses takes his wooden staff and he strikes that rock not once, but twice. And water gushed out of that rock. The people are saved once again. Even the livestock are saved. So where's the mistake? Where'd Moses go wrong? What misdeed did he commit? Remember, God was so upset by this incident that Moses was denied entering the promised land with the people. Moses would die on top of a mountain as he would see the people enter the promised land. but he was not allowed to go into it himself. So what was Moses' mistake? First, Moses didn't follow directions. God told him to speak to the rock, not strike it with his staff. And he struck it twice. Does that sound like splitting hairs? It does to me. It does to me. I've got to admit that. Come on, God. He brought him out of Egypt. He didn't run away from Pharaoh. Oh, at first he didn't think he could do it. At first he didn't want to do it. But he was your man. He followed through with your instructions. He didn't run from the assignment. Come on! Who cares whether you speak to the rock or hit it with your staff, even twice? Who cares? How does that change history? It saved the people. But I don't think that's what got Moses in trouble. Do you remember what Moses said to the people right before he struck that rock with his staff? He said, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water from out of this rock?" Here Moses wasn't talking about God and himself. He was talking about Aaron and himself. Must we, Aaron and I, bring you water from this rock? Does that sound picky? Not to God. If God is going to save the people, God did not want the people to be dependent upon anyone or anything but God himself. And why might that be? Because that's how golden calves and other idols have their beginning. But there's even more evidence that Moses confused things here. If we go further into the Bible to the book of Deuteronomy, the 3rd chapter, beginning with verse 23, we see Moses says to the people are gathered again, and Moses says to them, and this is near the end of Moses' life. They are about to enter the promised land without Moses. And Moses says to these people, "I have pleaded with the Lord. O sovereign Lord," Moses said to God, "you have shown to your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or in earth who can do the deeds and the mighty works that you do? Let me go over and see the good land beyond the river Jordan, that fine hill country and Lebanon." And then turning to his full focus upon the people, once again, Moses says to the people, "But because of you." Are you getting it? But because of you, the Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me. You getting the picture here? Clearly, Moses had pleaded with God, just like you and I would have, to let him go with the people into the promised land. And clearly God said one more time, no. Moses was blaming the people here, wasn't he, for his misfortune. What was Moses' mistake? First, he didn't follow directions. And I know that's picky, but he didn't. Second, Moses took credit. He and Aaron took credit for the water that came and saved the people. And third, Moses blamed the people instead of examining himself and the mistakes he had made. It is so easy to blame God. It is easy to blame other people sometimes. I know that. I've done that. All of us have done that. Moses needed to only look to himself. In this theme of sermons, we're looking at 5 beliefs that need to be held by a Christian. What is the least I can believe and still be a Christian? We're looking at the real rock-bottom foundations. And last week, or 2 weeks ago, what did we point out? We start at the proper starting place, the Bible itself. It tells us about God and who God is. It tells us about ourselves and who we are. And it tells us, with God's help, what we can become. The Bible is there, inspired by God when it was written, but more importantly, inspired by God as you read it and try to apply it to your lives. Another belief would be this one. We seldom find ourselves as we truly are, but we often find in others what we overlook in ourselves. That's kind of a nice way of simply saying, we are sinners. In Matthew's Gospel, the 7th chapter, beginning with verse 3, Jesus asks, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Perhaps one of the most missing attributes that people have is a genuine humility. A person with a genuine humility will still be a sinner in the eyes of God. But such a person will be less likely defensive about it. I think that's important. Nothing can tell us better just who another person is than when they say something like, I've been wrong. I've made a mistake. It's been easier for me to blame you than it is to look at the truth inside of me. I've acted like a fool, and I wish there was some way I could take that back. Nothing tells us more quickly who that other person is than when they genuinely and humbly say that kind of thing to us. We honestly don't see Moses say that kind of thing. It's just not in here. In spite of all of the really great things that Moses did, far more than I will ever accomplish, he didn't admit his wrong. Instead, he blamed people for his mistake. And you know, he took that to his deathbed. I don't think that should change our high esteem that we hold for Moses. Not at all. And rightfully so. But it did change God's plan for Moses in the eyes of God, and rightfully so. We should not forget that when Jesus took the disciples, Peter, James, and John, to the top of the mountain where Jesus was transfigured, the 2 Old Testament figureheads that showed up that day, one was Moses, the other was Elijah. The point isn't whether God could forgive Moses. Heavens, that's not the point. The point is that even someone as great and dedicated to God as Moses was can sometimes sin and be blind to it. And if that can happen to him, that can happen to me. It can happen to all of us. In the 4th and final year of my seminary training, I took a year-long course there in Dallas, the seminary where I attended. They had a unique relationship with a number of hospitals in the area, and we as students, would go and we would serve as chaplains at those hospitals. There were hospital peer groups who evaluated us of our experiences that we had there, and there were always learning experiences when we'd get together in those peer groups. They were always confronting, but always helpful. I was assigned to the Parkland Hospital. You know, that's where President Kennedy was pronounced dead. And specifically, I was assigned to the adult burn unit of that hospital. It was truly eye-opening and heart-opening all year long. One lady in the burn unit was slipping away from us. She had been there for some time, but she just wasn't going to make it. She knew it. I was making the rounds that particular day, and I stopped in to see this lady. We had spent untold hours together, talking about so many different things. There I was as a want-to-be minister, and I had somehow been what she needed me to be on all of those previous occasions. I walked in wearing my little white collar. We had to wear them to be chaplains in the hospital at that time. And she looked up at me and said, "Reverend, can you call the Catholic priest? I need to make my final confession." And that's exactly what I did. Ironically, in all of our visits, I never knew she was Catholic. I never knew that. Somehow I thought to myself, I had neglected to ask her that question. It was clear, however, in our many talks with each other that she was a Christian. But now, in her final hours, she wanted to confess to a priest. You know what a beautiful thing that is? One that faithful Catholics will try to practice right to this very day. But here's the thing. After she died, I looked at her original papers, you know, the papers that her son had to fill out when he brought her to the hospital after her accident. And under the words religious preference, he had written Protestant. Protestant. At first I thought, well, that's strange. Here she's Catholic and she needs a priest to come and hear her final confession, but her son wrote Protestant. Could it be that he didn't know what she really was? And then I remember thinking, that's not possible. A son is going to know whether his mother is a Catholic or a Protestant. Instead, I think this dear lady was a Protestant all along. But now she wanted to make a confession of her life before she died. And I think she knew who could do that better than a Catholic priest. You and I going down the street here, telling everyone on both sides of the street all of our mistakes and all of our sins, that's just not something you and I need to do. It probably wouldn't make common sense. But telling God our mistakes, that's a different thing altogether. And when that lady told her sins to a Catholic priest, that was equivalent to telling God her mistakes and sins. The truth is, we are all sinners. And we, as Christians, need to talk to God about those sins often. May God bring us a humble heart. May God help us see the plank that is in our own eye. May God help us discover those times when it is right for us to say, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Amen.
Thank you for joining us on our pre-recorded Sunday morning service. If you would like a copy, you can contact the office at 660-359-6762 or email us at wesleyum@sbcglobal.net. Feel free to visit us in person or online at wesleyunitedmethodist.us, where you will always find open hearts, open minds, and open doors. May the blessings of Jesus Christ be upon you in every aspect of your life.